All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're running a few minutes late. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Did you have a question, Megan? Or just, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items to take care of. Madam Clerk, do we have our, there we go. Members that are, so Ms. Cohen has submitted a written request to virtually attend today's work session due to a personal conflict. All those in favor of approving this request, please raise your hands. It's Ms. Marin, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, Ms. Dernak-Kofax, Ms. Tolan, Ms. Omesh, Ms. McLaughlin, Mr. Frisch, Dr. Anderson, and myself. That motion passes. Welcome, Ms. Cohen. Is she on? Yeah, I'm going to do mine. Ms. Cohen, can we do a mic check, please? Yeah, I'm going to do that. I've got a list. Will you let me know, is Ms. Keys-Gamarra on yet? Okay, we'll do Ms. Keys-Gamarra when she hops on. So one more, Ms. Pekarsky has submitted a written request to virtually attend today's work session due to a medical conflict. All those in favor of approving this request, please raise your hands. Dr. Anderson, Mr. Frisch, Ms. McLaughlin, Ms. Omesh, Ms. Tolan, Mr. Dernak-Kofax, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, Ms. Marin, and myself. That is approved. Ms. Pekarsky, can we do a mic check, please?
Yeah, I'm here.
Welcome. Hope you feel better soon. Is that Ms. Cohen connecting, Christina? Okay. Ms. Cohen, can we do a mic check when you, I guess you're still connecting to audio, so we'll give you a minute.
I'm good. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Welcome, Ms. Cohen. If Ms. Keys-Gamarra pops on, let me know and we'll add her in. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's very exciting to have our work session, our educational equity policy. I know this has been a long time in the making, and your team has worked very, very hard on it. So I really appreciate your hard work and all of you being here at this late hour. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Reed to introduce the topic.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to center everyone in the room for a moment with a short video. So Jesse, please, and Christina, thank you.
It has been said that the road to equality begins on Equity Street. So what does that really mean? Where equality means providing the same to all, equity recognizes that we do not all start from the same place, and therefore we must acknowledge that, and then make adjustments to the imbalances that do exist. Equity does not require one to lower standards. Rather, it calls on us to remove any barriers that might prevent one from achieving that standard. Equity does not ask us to disregard one's unique talents, gifts, or accomplishments. Rather, it calls on us to work intentionally at identifying those talents and gifts, and then leveraging them to support achievement. Finally, equity is not intended to hurt or harm. Rather, it is meant to help and heal. In FCPS, the work of equity shows up when we make intentional decisions that gives all students access and opportunities based on their strengths as well as their needs. It is a commitment to affirming our students regardless of how they show up, to love them, to nurture them and their gifts, and to ensure they thrive. Equity led us to provide MiFi devices to families during the pandemic so that they did not have to drive to a school parking lot just to access Wi-Fi and engage in their learning. Equity led us to invest as a system in turf fields in schools where those resources were not available so that every athlete has access to facilities that are safe and conditioned in ways in which they could perform at their peak. Equity directs us to ensure that we provide students and families who might not otherwise have access to appropriate devices and resources in all environments to support their learning and perform at their highest potential. Equity requires us to recognize that students have different interests, and thus it is our responsibility to provide rigorous programming and multiple pathways to ensure their lifelong success. Equity leads us to value and honor the cultures and traditions that our students and families hold, and to learn about and connect with one another in ways that may not always seem possible. Our FCPS superintendent, Dr. Michelle Reed, often reminds us that we are preparing students for careers that do not yet exist. STEM education is one such gateway towards this preparation. We acknowledge that we have systems and structures that predictably prevent some students from accessing these rich learning opportunities. Thus, equity compels us to ensure that this uneven positioning of students is disrupted and that all students have access. If we do not remove the systemic barriers that are blocking some of our students from thriving, then we are simply not doing our jobs. It means we will have failed these students, and even these students. We owe it to our students to create and maintain a system that's grounded in excellence, equity, and opportunity.
Thanks, Josie. I think it's important. I think it's important to recall the purpose of this work, which is the future of our community and our country. And I just really want to thank the team for the lengthy engagement calendar this year. There have been a lot of touch points, which I know we'll review in your presentation. And just want to remind our board and community that the equity commitments that are central to our strategic plan have to come to life in a significant way, in a material way, for our students to fully realize their unique potential. It's our responsibility. So as the board this evening reviews the work, which is a summation of honestly years of work, but in particular this year's work, I look forward to the robust presentation that's planned and look forward to the discourse this evening so that we can emerge prepared to support this work moving forward. So thank you, and it's my pleasure to introduce our Chief Equity Officer, Dr. Nardis King.
Thank you, Dr. Reed, and thank you to our esteemed board members and to the community, faculty, and staff who joined us this evening. I want to start off by thanking Dr. Reed for her support throughout this process and being the lead champion of this work. I want to introduce the members of the Equity Policy Group and express my profound gratitude for their invaluable work that each of them have accomplished in developing this equity policy. Dr. Sloan Presidio, Kathleen Waltz, Dr. Iona Spikes, Nina Thomas, Kim Amenabar, Dr. Shannon Merriweather, Dr. Renee La Huffman-Jackson, Dr. Manny Gomez-Portillo, Dr. Alicia Martinez, Dr. Shannon Anderson, Christy Scott. Collectively, you have made monumental strides in our pursuit of equity. The level of thoughtfulness, rigor, and integrity you have poured into this policy is truly commendable. You have set an outstanding example of what can be achieved when diverse minds unite behind a shared commitment. Thank you for your tireless efforts and unwavering commitment to our mission. I would also like to thank the members of the Equity Steering Committee and the Equity Policy Focus Groups for their time, input, and dedication to ensuring that this equity policy meets the needs of our students. And a special thank you to Dr. Lisa Williams for providing her expertise and her thought partnership throughout the process. Next slide, please. I want to ground us by referring us to our One Fairfax policy. Remember that the work we are charged with, conducting analysis, devising plans, setting goals, and taking action through specific practices, policies, and initiatives. The Fairfax County Public Schools Equity Policy will be one example of how we are honoring that commitment and supporting an equitable culture. Next slide, please. So why an equity policy? If you look at the picture before you, at first glance, it is a hopeful and positive image. And in many ways, this picture also exemplifies our need for an equity policy. This student is accessing his AC device in a self-contained classroom with no peers but 3 teachers by his side. Do you think he has equal access to the device in a general education setting? Do you think the device is populated with curricular language that allows him to communicate with his peers about the content he is learning? Are we sure that both his general education and special education teachers have the capacity and the efficacy to support his augmented and adaptive communication across settings? In many environments throughout our system, the answers to those questions would be no, no, and maybe not. And because that may be a reality for many of our children, the why of adopting an equity policy becomes quite clear. The purpose of an equity policy is to do more than simply giving students minimal access, but to create a system in which every student receives an exceptional educational experience that meets their needs in many ways, other ways builds upon their strengths. Next slide, please. Here are some additional examples of highlighted the need for the equity policy for your consideration today. We want students to have access to augmentative and alternative communication, among other accommodations, to allow them full access to general education curriculum. More so, we need systems in place to teach teachers to fully utilize accommodations in order to allow students fully inclusive experiences and not be regulated to their use in self-contained settings with limited access. When we consider an EAL plan, we understand that initiative was driven by analyzing a wealth of data that demonstrates a history of inequity in our student outcomes. Rather than piecemealing our commitment to equity, we must systematize our work to create processes and structures that allow for accountability and measure towards equity as a priority. Finally, we have many students who do not have access to up-to-date resources and facilities. Most often, these students continue to be those who are marginalized in many spaces within our system. Examples such as these remind us of the need to demonstrate our commitment to equity and equitable outcomes by creating structures that prioritize fidelity, accountability, and systematization. Next slide, please. Speaking of systematization, Dr. Williams reminds us that this work of equity is best done and most effective when we take a systematic approach. When we are not moving in the same direction and working cohesively as a unit, we might notice that our random acts of equity often allow inequities within our system. So as we began this process, it was important to consider what we would include, what structures and systems don't demonstrate that we are centering our work on equity, and those that do. So in the next few slides, I'm going to highlight what we included and the connections we made with our actions that are guiding our work in our division. Next slide, please. First, we began to really think about and have discussion around how we implement equitable practices with fidelity, how we ensure accountability of our actions, and how we move in ways that demonstrate we are a school system and not merely a system of schools. As we begin to identify themes, ways, and ideas in which to codify our commitment to creating welcoming, inclusive, and culturally responsive school and work environments, we looked to other divisions, both near and far. We found that there are countless public school systems who have already adopted equity policies. We also examined the various components included in each, along with rationale that highlights historic marginalization and injustice faced by certain groups of students and families. Here you see a comparison between our equity policy draft and 7 other divisions. As indicated here, the 2 policies in which we are most closely aligned are Howard County, Maryland, and Virginia Beach. Next slide, please. As you are aware, there are 7 components of the proposed equity policy which are shown here. The first 3 components are considered our foundation, and they set the direction of the policy, while the last 4 sections are intended to identify our priorities and demonstrate how we address them. Next slide, please. In the next 2 slides, I'm going to give you a moment to reconnect with these components, reminding you what each represents and why they were included. So first, take a moment to review the first 3 components, remembering that these are foundational and set in our direction. Next slide, please. Here you see the last 4 components that identify our priorities and speak to how we will address them. I will give you another few minutes to review these as well. Next slide, please. The strategic plan is a specific document with an ending. The equity policy remains in place forever to guide how we care for our students, staff, and families. As stated previously, we look to systems and structures that connect to this work. Our new strategic plan is equity-centered and it is student-centered. As such, it was important that we highlighted where there was alignment between the equity commitments for each goal and various components of the equity policy. To highlight a few, just as we say we are committed to in Goal 1, to authentic and affirming partnerships with families and key stakeholders, we hold ourselves accountable in the equity policy to ensure that there is stakeholder feedback in decision-making processes. Just as we say we are committed in Goal 2 to provide access to challenging academic programs and necessary supports, we amplify our belief in the equity policy that it is our responsibility to enact policies and practices to ensure all students have access and opportunity to achieve at their highest potential. And just as we committed in Goal 5, centering student voice data and using evidence to ensure students are ready, prepared, and successful, we have prioritized student agency in the equity policy to foster co-equal learning environments that support student interests, learning styles, strengths, and needs. The strategic plan is just one example of several that will be supported by the adoption of the equity policy. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? This work was started over a year ago, and as we began to close out this process, we wanted to highlight some of the key dates and actions. Next slide, please. This is a high-level overview of the actions that have been taken to bring this policy to fruition. You have seen this before, and it's only been updated as tasks were added and/or additional interactions occurred. I do want to put a spotlight on our stakeholder engagement campaign that occurred between November of 2022 and March of this year. Next slide, please. As you can see on this slide, we essentially had 311 touch points with internal and external stakeholders. We held 24 sessions that resulted in over 50 hours of direct stakeholder interaction. Specifically, we held 18 focus groups and 6 sessions for Equity Policy Steering Committee. The number in parentheses indicates the approximate number of people we engaged in each session. Next slide, please. This list shows the various organizations who were represented in the focus group sessions. Again, we held 18 sessions with representatives from 14 different stakeholder groups and/or organizations. This list shows the organizations represented in the steering committee. We held 6 sessions with representatives from 19 different stakeholder groups and/or organizations. If you were to compare the 2 participation lists, you will notice that we extended our outreach and engaged representatives from 10 additional stakeholder groups to serve on the Equity Policy and Steering Committee. Next slide, please. With the broad representation of stakeholders we engaged, there were common themes that arose during these interactions. We received feedback on both the technical aspect of the policy as well as the spirit of the policy. Our stakeholders lifted up things like flexibility, adaptability, follow-through, clear communication, and accessibility. I also want to point out that there was a primary task of the Equity Policy Steering Committee was to provide language, thoughts, and ideas specifically on the responsibility components of the policy. What is represented in this section is the combined thinking of FCPS employees and internal and external stakeholders. Next slide, please. As we close out this portion of the presentation, I invite you to keep these big ideas in mind. This equity policy will be a historic action for this board, and we are essentially turning the page on how we will intentionally address inequities in our institution. Additionally, adoption of this policy will honor the commitment we made as a system to support the One Fairfax policy. This policy will always remind us who we serve and that we are responsible for educating students and providing each of them with tools and resources needed to thrive. It will allow us to create our own narrative and communicate what we truly believe in and stand for. It will guide our policies and practices and mandate us to examine our actions, behaviors, and decisions from an equity lens. And finally, it will require us to take a systematic approach for how we operate and ensure that there is cohesiveness and alignment across all systems, structures throughout the division. Thank you for this opportunity to present this draft equity policy to this board. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, addressing clarifying questions, and engaging in further dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Megan, I saw you raise your hand earlier. Did you want to speak? I wasn't sure if you wanted to speak earlier or you were just raising your hand for something else. Okay, all right, just want to make sure. Board members, if you wish to speak, go ahead and put your placards up, and I'll call on you in turn. So we'll start with Megan and then Ricky.
Great, thank you. And I do really appreciate the extensive amount of work that's been done here. I think, Dr. Reed, the first thing that I just really wanted to set the table on is that not only do I believe in this work, but that several of my colleagues, both Ms. Karen Corbett-Sanders and Ms. Darnette Kofax, in the prior board, we did this. And so I really do want to first make sure that for you, your administration, and the public understands that when our board passed the One Fairfax policy in November 21st of 2017, it specifically says in that policy, which we did jointly with the Board of Supervisors, this policy informs all other policies and applies to all publicly delivered services for Fairfax County government and FCPS, that it's to advance equity in alignment with our stated visions and priorities, and that it also talks about in Section 4 all of the accountability frameworks that we will have for it. So, Dr. King, I really appreciated where you talked about how important it is that it's what we believe in, what we stand for, seeing things through the equity lens, requiring systemic approach, and yet it says that this will be historic action and turning the page. And that pains me a little bit, Dr. Reed, because in 2017, that prior board and the Board of Supervisors, we made that commitment then, that it was a race and social equity policy above all policies. So I do want to just start that there because it is what we have stood for and it is what we have expected. And I welcome anything that reinforces that work, but it worries me that when you crosswalk what this One Fairfax policy said in November 2017, I'm starting to worry if we did that 5.5 years ago and said all the things that mirror what we're doing now, what's happened in the 5.5 years? So I was hoping maybe, Dr. Reed, that you or Dr. King, someone might want to talk about how this will distinguish from the One Fairfax policy that we, the prior board and the administration committed to, and how have we been deficient then in carrying out what we thought was the policy of all policies. So
thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I think one of the things that I really asked Dr. King to put up front was the One Fairfax policy, because we know that that's the policy from which this policy generates. I would say that this policy adds clarification and language. And to Dr. King's point, the One Fairfax requires us to have policies that address more specifically or put a finer point to the goals and expectations of One Fairfax. So I believe this policy builds on that work. And as all things, there's an evolution of ideas and work. So perhaps it's another historic phase, maybe instead of trying to think the paleontology, whatever the stages of history, but maybe we're moving into a new historic sort of time. I do think connecting this work with really, how do I want to call strategic indicators in terms of academic achievement and opportunity, while maintaining a reputation for excellence is really something that's getting to, if you will, a laser focus on that. And I believe this policy builds on, if you will, the global context and takes the work from the boardroom and the Board of Supervisors room directly to the classroom.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. I concur. And Megan, I think we shared this in our 1x1 or 2x2. I don't remember which one we had with you about exactly what Dr. Reed said, that the One Fairfax compels us to go deeper, and this policy will allow us to go deeper and be specific to addressing any concerns that we see that have not been addressed in the past 5 years. Yes, what you guys did is honored, and that's why we centered and began with that, right? We do appreciate, and so I'm sorry if my words pained you, because I never want to pain you, Megan, you know that. But it does compel us to go deeper.
I completely appreciate that, Dr. King, and I really enjoyed our conversation with your team. No, it's more important to me just about making sure that we also look at the fact that if we had the One Fairfax policy, which goes very specifically in terms of how we will commit ourselves to equity and everything that we're going to do here, I just want to, number one, maybe correct that chart, because it bothers me to see that we're looking like the school division that took 20 years to get on board, because we weren't. In 2017, this school division expressed its commitment, and I think it needs to be corrected to 2017. And I know my time is up, so I'll just need to go back. But I support anything we do to deepen the work, but I really think that we need to have an accurate history too.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. Dr. Anderson?
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of you for this very protracted work. You have done, I think, a really great job of engaging, and you could see by the people in the room, there's a high level of interest. And I know there are a lot of people in the room who are part of your participants list, so thank you for all of your efforts to that work. And also shout out to the two Mason principals who I see in the back there, Mr. Powell and Ms. Barnes. Just digging into the document a little bit, one of the things that you talked about here that shows throughout the document and also the video is being intentional. And so that is something that I'm taking to heart, and I'm looking at this document also through that lens. When I look at the definition section, I think I continue to struggle with the definition of the term equity. I know this was something that we talked about during our 2x2, and I would love to kind of hear your thinking as to why what seems to be before us is not, for me, is less of a definition rather than an approach, a framework, a principle of action, as you added here, which I also appreciate. But I'm looking for it to be a little bit more consistent with the other terms that are defined in a way that we can find in other reference materials.
Thank you for that thoughtful question. Dr. Anderson, we're going to allow Dr. Williams to respond to you.
All right, I get the big guns.
I'm sure that what I'm going to offer, it will be insufficient to the question that you're asking, because in so many ways, and it actually goes to the point, Megan, that you just made, as this work evolves, we need to put ourselves in the best position to be responsive as possible. And so depending on what resources you refer to, you're going to see the term defined in many ways, right? But what we try to acknowledge here in this definition is that there are two things we need to do. Without writing a dissertation for a definition. We need to understand the past and how the past has positioned us in ways that are less optimal for all of the students that we serve now, and we need to commit to the kind of vigilance and diligence that allows us to have those hard conversations as we make decisions in the present. And so I think that what we are trying to do here is to reconcile that abstraction of, so what does it mean to have past inequities that have shaped what we are sitting and contending with today? And then, like, how do we interrupt those ways of moving forward? That's not concise, it's not clean, it's nebulous, but I think it gives us the flexibility to be brave and courageous. So those are my thoughts about why we constructed the definition in the way that we did.
Right, thank you, and I appreciate all of what you've shared, and I don't disagree with any of it. I just think that there's a space for them to live in other parts of this document under the purpose and definitely the beliefs, but I registered my concern, and I will move on. One of the things that I also want to highlight is, particularly in the video, you showed the part with the turf field, having a space where students can be their best selves on the athletic fields. I don't see that being illustrated throughout this document, because we know that there's opportunity for access to educational opportunities, there's access to other things, but I don't see here where we are being intentional with our facilities, because we know they are not all created equal. And I did also share this in my 2x2 and my follow-up notes. I see space for us to offer that, and the accountability and the measurement, and again, the spaces that I shared with you, which I'm happy to recount again, but I would like for us to be intentional that we're also looking for our students to walk into spaces that are just as equitable, just as pleasing as other spaces, because we know, I watched a Joe Clark movie. I'm a former principal. You have a school that looks a certain way, it makes you feel a certain way. So I was really looking for that to be reflected here.
Again, thank you for that question. I believe that that's addressed under the responsibilities of the Chief Operations Officer as well. We highlight that they will guarantee safe and well-equipped facilities. Do you see that as on F?
I do.
And it's in accountability and measurements as well.
Well, I think I was looking for it to be under the priorities as well, because we have school environment where it's not as intentional here. We have started to address it here, but I would like some stronger language, and I'll take a go back, please.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Noted.
Thank you. I'll put you on the go-back list. Ms. Corbett-Sanders?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for all of your hard work. Kind of following up on both my colleagues, I would suggest a couple things. One, I think that there is room for actually having a definition of equity as an opportunity to educate our community on what equity is. What is in the document today is the belief structure surrounding equity, which I think we can all agree to, but because we know that the people in this room are not the only people who are going to be looking at this document, I would actually encourage that we provide a real definition of what equity is. We have some of that language in the strategic plan. I would also suggest that there is a real need to have a continuum that addresses the fact that in this policy it needs to reflect that in 2017 both boards supported and adopted a One Fairfax policy, and that there is a need to go deeper in that policy, and that's why we have an equity policy for Fairfax County Public Schools. The second thing that I would also suggest, because I look at this as a way of educating the public and bringing people along with us. And it can either bring people along or it can become something that people throw darts at. And we don't want people to throw darts at it. We want people as a community to embrace what we're trying to do. So we have an opportunity to truly educate people on what this is all about. So I would suggest that we do need to have a little bit more definitions around what equity really is versus the belief structure surrounding equity, which is what we have in here. The second thing that I would also suggest is that we may want to give a definition of what marginalization is, because oftentimes people don't understand the terms marginalization or disproportionality. And when they don't understand, it's not in your definitions.
It is.
Disproportionality is?
No,
Or-
marginalization.
Oh, marginalization is, okay, I'm sorry, but the disproportionality is not. And so when we give definitions, we give people the opportunity to come along with us on our journey. And then the other thing that I really think is important in this policy is when you read it, we spent the afternoon talking about operational expectations. I look at many of the tasks, essentially, or the activities of each of the cabinet level functions that are listed in this document as being operational expectations for equity. And so we want to be clearer about that's really what we're trying to do here. And so from my standpoint, if we could, just to wrap it up, connect this to the One Fairfax policy, connect this to our strategic plan so that people see the linkages, and then provide some further definitions. I think that that would really be helpful to bring the community along with us. Although, as you can tell, we have a lot of the community who are with us on it, but there are some that just would benefit from a better understanding of what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tolan?
Thank you. Thank you very much for all this work. I loved the video. The video, I thought, did a really great job of explaining, where we would implement equity and what it is. And so I want to piggyback on what a number of my colleagues have already said. When I look at the definition of equity in the policy, and then I compare it to, I'm looking at this document, from our strategic planning process, and we have an equity means, kind of definition in here. I feel like the definition that we have in this document is, and I'm also struggling, trying to be goals and then implementation, underneath it, kind of going with the strategic plan. This definition to me is more overarching and really gets at all students and has a lot of the language that you had in the video. And then when I look at the definition that we have in the policy, I agree with what people have said previously. To me, these are our beliefs under that. So, Dr. Williams, I completely agree with you that these are things we need to kind of look back on and think about. There are 2 sentences here. I could see them easily just turned into 2 bullets underneath the beliefs section. These are things we believe about how we would implement this more broad definition. So that was one thing. I also was, the first belief that we have listed here, and this, I had kind of rewritten this a little bit, and it also kind of gets to Megan's point. We already are doing some of this work, and we've done quite a bit of work over the years on trying to look at policies, change policies. And so instead of just saying FCPS must enact policies and practices, I might say something like FCPS must continue to enact and improve policies and practices, because we have things in place, but as we use them and work with them, we see how they need to be improved. When we look at our data around disproportionality, et cetera, we talked about that earlier today. When we look at the data and the information, we see, okay, this is working, this is not working. We're going to have to continually improve all of the policies in order to meet this. So that's just like a wordsmithing thing, but gets at that idea that we have been working on it and need to improve. Also, the last item under beliefs, I would just take a look at it. Again, I don't want to wordsmith, but to me, it's talking about limiting these things, our academic priorities. I think it just needs to be reworded. It's like a double negative. So I just wanted to point that out.
Are you referring to the last bullet under
Last
beliefs?
bullet, where it says limited access, opportunity, accommodation should be considered top academic priorities. I don't think we want limited access to be a priority. I think it's just a slight wording change, or maybe I'm just not reading it properly. So, okay, I'm out of
Thank you.
town. So,
Okay.
Thank you. Carl?
Thanks, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into this by everybody over the last year. Looking at the definitions, I concur with Dr. Anderson and others that a straightforward definition of equity is in need here. And the language, you can't get around this issue without addressing the systemic barriers that have been in place that result in protracted disproportionality. And I think acknowledging that belongs in the beliefs, and it could just as easily, and I will do a little wordsmithing, but FCPS must work to redress and address, et cetera. It fits neatly in the framework of the other beliefs. So I would encourage that. In terms of other portions, in policymaking, sometimes we've had policies that have been so specific, and we identify the roles or responsibilities for different employees within the division, that when those jobs are eliminated or changed, or titles are changed, what happens to the policy? The board has to come back and address it. So I would suggest identifying these as the responsibility of the superintendent or their designee. I can appreciate some of the specificity of it, but that gets us into trouble if there's a reorganization at any point or if job titles change. So I think that's a must, regardless of what else changes in here. So just a piece of housekeeping. I'm encouraged by it and by the policy overall, and look forward to the conversation continuing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Marin?
Thank you. I want to express my enthusiasm for really the scholars that are at this table and in this room in our community who have contributed to this work. They were not only interested lay people, but true scholars that have studied this body of work with research and data. So I'm really thrilled that of course, any of our work should be backed by that, but particularly in this field. I wanted to ask about two things. One was in the priorities section, which is number 4. I'm wondering if your team had been intentional on the ordering of those priorities, because I could picture a different ordering of them, but I wanted to see what you thought.
We put them in alphabetical order.
Okay, well, so that's kind of intentional. So I had a different thought. I'm often looking at, what can the schools actually sort of control, what is under our purview. And certainly, as much as we try, we cannot, and nor do we deign to control families and communities, although we know how critical that is. So might it be more, effective to orient ourselves towards the things the school can primarily control, which are, teaching and learning, how we, engage with our workforce, school funding, the school environment. So basically, taking those more school-focused pieces up front. That was my thought, because even just looking at the page, the first priority looks as family and community partnerships, when I know, as important as that is, we are focused on the teaching and learning and retaining our workforce. So that's something for consideration. The other question I had really relates to our earlier school board retreat, which was about policy governance, which is really going to, and we'll be sharing more with this publicly, but really shift us to more of an operational expectations. And so I've always been a little concerned about when we change something somewhere, how does that crosswalk to be changed in all those other policies and regulations? And I do see a list at the end of the draft that has the policies as well as the regulations. And people may know the policy is what the board sets, the regulation is how the superintendent interprets it and operationalizes it. But thinking about where we're headed with trying to better operationalize and track and measure and report on that, I'm just wondering, this is another one of those big opportunities. Do we start to tag so that we know, okay, this is just so overarching at the same time, but how are we going to ensure that as we go through every single group of policies or every single, the SR&R, we've got that on our docket right now. So I wonder, Dr. Reed, if you could speak a little bit about that, or just the intentionality of how you and your team will infuse that as we move into, this more transparent or more, rigorous governance model.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. I think that one of the keys about an operational policy is that this work's going to have to be integrated into the operational expectations and/or goal work that we're going to be committing to. The goal work has already been committed to, because in our strategic plan, we've already identified equity commitments as part of that plan. So those are going to be measured, checked, if you will, and reported on annually. I do agree that there's an intersectionality with Mr. Frisch's comment around the accountability piece, because that would match what we talked about earlier today as well in terms of a report. So I think this work already has linkages, and it fleshes out those linkages that are going to enable us to really, I believe, make the progress we need to make as per our strategic plan goals.
Well, and I think that the strategic plan has the equity focus piece. We'll keep reminding us, but again, as even Ms. McLaughlin began with, these things have been part of our fabric, but now we're really, sewing it in and making sure it's being done. So I look forward to doing that work and keeping the system accountable to it.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Mayor. And I think if I could mention a concrete example, one of the projects that the strategic plan also talks about is, and we've heard a lot of conversation recently around inclusive preschool and providing opportunities and spaces for our youngest learners to have the best experience educationally. And we know the best practice and research around that work. What we haven't made is a lot of progress over the last several years in increasing our ability to host preschool classrooms and ergo inclusive preschool classrooms, which take more space, right? Because we have more students we're serving. So I think what the strategic plan coupled with the equity policy forces us to look at all of those scenarios and say, what is the best positioning of the division so that each and every student that we're serving has the opportunity to reach their full potential. Now there's some really clear expectations here and within the strategic plan that you as a board are going to be monitoring beginning this very year. I mean, and the journey started this afternoon.
That's a great example, too, the inclusive preschool, and perhaps that could be another featured story that eventually shows the improvements that the division will make. But just real quickly about the definitions, and you mentioned potential and ability. That was one definition. I wondered, should we have ability in here? Although that's a protected class, and then we're going down that road of protected classes, but ability, because we do talk about each student to their ability, which might be mastery for one is different than mastery for another. So either ability or potential or capability was something I had wondered about as a possible definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Before I take my turn, I'll see if any other colleagues wish to speak. Abrar, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And just a huge thank you to staff and the community. I know this has just been a long time coming, and folks have been eagerly waiting and putting in so many hours. So long overdue, but we're here. So thank you all so much for everything you've put in to this. I think it's especially enlightening to see, Montgomery County in 2017, Arlington in 2020, and hopefully, as Ms. McLaughlin pointed out, the One Fairfax effort that inspired these deeper dives into this important area. I also just wanted to point to, the equity definition that's listed within this. I think there was already an attempt to do that, specifically using language like disproportionate outcomes and exclusion, predictable outcomes. I think those are some of the key words in that definition that speak to what that's about. So just want to direct my colleagues to that, and perhaps if they have, more specific questions around that, we can discuss that further. Just a couple of things. So I really liked seeing that we included traditional and non-traditional data sources as key points. I think that's critical, and just being able to understand how expansive our community is and how limited traditional or ways of data collection are in informing us and giving us a clear picture, especially with communities that aren't traditionally the ones that speak up or that we have deep relationships with quite yet. And also the point that all students can succeed, right? It's this commitment that any shortcoming is a systemic failure, is something we can do to meet them where they're at, rather than something inherent to any student. I may have added something around families not being inherently less engaged too, because I think on the one side, it's something, has something to do with what we think of student capability. And on the other side, it's what we think about parents and families and the extent of their engagement, whether they care or not, right, when they show up or don't. So I think it might be useful to have a belief statement around that. But in any case, other low-hanging fruit, I think, bias in defining it. I don't know, maybe y'all thought this through, so feel free to please let me know what decision, what guided you to or not include certain things. But I think it's useful to say that we all have bias, and that bias is not inherently bad, but just informs the lens that we come with. That might kind of destigmatize conversations around, checking our bias and whatnot. But would love to hear some feedback around why that wasn't included if thought was already given to it. I was looking, because I think while we state the belief or the definition, when we implement it, so like under school environment, where we use the word bias, we end up falling into saying, so interactions are free from prejudice or bias. But do we believe that it's possible for people to actually check all their bias out the door? I don't know that it is, right? So maybe we can say that interactions are not influenced by prejudice or bias, right? I think that's a more realistic expectation, right? I see this is my time. I certainly have more to share, but I'll take a go back. And if anyone has kind of response to any of the things I said that may have been thought through before.
I'll put you in a go back, Ms. Namesh.
Yeah.
Any comments from staff before we move on?
Bart, can you just go back and tell us which one you were on? I missed where you were talking about in your suggestion.
So,
Under the bias.
yeah, bias, both the definition and then where it showed up in school environment under priorities.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is interesting to me, right? Because the definition that we have in the definition section is more straightforward, which is kind of what the feedback we're getting about the equity definition. What you are asking for is more an explanation about how bias functions, right? And so I think the tension in the development of any policy document is trying to be clear, but not overly, like, this is not professional development. And I think that part of what I would lift for our consideration is some of this work, I think we're going to actualize, we're going to need to actualize and then come back to the document and ask ourselves, is this reflective of what's been going on and where we want to go? Because there is this tension between how much of this can we present straight in a straightforward way, and then how much stuff really does bear explanation. And so we wrestle with that. Which is why we didn't talk about bias as a normalized condition and everybody has it. So those are my thoughts, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll put you on a go back. Tammy? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But it is neutral. It is neutral, that we were intentional in the neutrality of the bias, but we did not do what you said, which was say that it can be, you can be biased towards something. So understood.
Thank you. Mr. Arnett Colfax?
All righty. Thank you all. Thank you all for your hard work on this. And it has indeed been an evolution. I too love the video. And I personally, because of the length of time I've been on this board, I've had the privilege of being on this journey with so many of you. Dr. King, as first you were a principal when I was there. And we talked about equity in our very first meeting when we met. And we talked about it in broad terms, more of inequities, what we were seeing in schools that I was newly representing at the time, that happened in both economically disadvantaged and diverse schools that I was representing. And we have had many conversations on that through the years. Ms. Amnabar, you and Dr. King and I think it was Dr. Duran, we attended Virginia's first equity conference together. And that was eye-opening because I saw it from a different lens there. And some of it, I even think we said, we're not ready for that yet. We did. We said that. It was the four of us that were there. And I also, and that happened right around the time, I think, several, again, Dr. Duran, Dr. Presidio, and many other members of FCPS leadership team who were there with Ms. McLaughlin and I as Skip took that different road and said, look, because we started out as a pre-K situation, right? And we're like, we're not going to get to where we need to be or break down barriers, not just with pre-K. We have to look at this from this wider perspective and develop that one Fairfax, which is a racial and socioeconomic equity policy. I appreciate, Dr. Reed, you talking about why this policy needs to work in tandem with that and how it goes deeper. And I think that's extremely important. I'm looking at my time, as far as the definition, I don't have wordsmithing available, but I do see there's some churn on that. And maybe if we look at what is presented in the strategic plan as opposed to what, in tandem with what is this, and they should align, I think. I really think they should align in some way, if not completely, at least portions of this definition in the strategic plan and vice versa. So at this point, I'll do my go back since I only have 19 seconds for the for that. But what I want to say, and I know there's fear out there that equity is going to take away merit And I'd like to speak on that and my go back to say how that I don't believe is going to happen, and that's not what I think anyone on this board wants to happen.
Thank you, Ms. Janet Kofax. I will take my turn, then we'll go to go-backs. First, just again, thank you to your team for your hard work. I know Ms. Pekarsky and I were the ones who actually brought the forum topic originally on, with Ms. Williams guiding us there, and so welcome back. Thank you, or Dr. Williams, excuse me, I apologize for coming back, and thank you for coming back. I wanted just to lift up a couple things. First, just a little wordsmithing in the definition. I appreciate putting neurodiversity in there, but it should be neurodivergent. Neurodiversity is being, the people are referred to as neurodivergent. So just a wordsmithing word there. Neurodiversity is the being neurodiverse. It's the, anyway, I will stop there before I stumble on any more words. I really appreciate all of this. One thing I wanted to lift up is I'm really missing the word inclusion kind of throughout. It is in here. It's not that it's not. But for example, it's missing from both the measurement and the accountability. There's nothing about inclusion in there. It's included in instructional practices, but not school environments. I'm glad in the responsibilities section, it was included under the responsibilities of the board, but not any of the chiefs. So I just think that's a missing piece there because we know that's something that really does infect. So I would recommend, if you're going to look at it for the chiefs, I would put under J and K. I'm just scrolling to that section. The chief of schools, regional assistant superintendent. We talk about in creating systems and structures that promote safe, productive, and culturally responsive environments. I might put inclusive environments in there also. When you look at K, school-based administrators, nurturing a school culture that's safe, supportive, affirming, inclusive, and conducive. I just think there's places in there. It does talk about it with L, with employees, but in terms of the chief's level, it wasn't in there. So I would put that. I'm glad it's with the board. Same with measurement. We look at, I know it's including but not limited to in measurement, but you don't have inclusion in any of those measurements. And considering that we failed indicator 5 15 years in a row, I think it would be an important one to add. So just some suggestions there. Same with accountability. I would put inclusion in there. And I think on the last bullet where it says ensuring stakeholder feedback, I might add feedback and engagement, right, is important, central to decision making. Just a few thoughts, because I know we really are talking a lot about engagement. Similarly with the school environment, it's great that we talk about instructional practices that are inclusive, but we want to make sure the environment is inclusive, right? So it's not just what happens in the classroom, but what happens in the school community writ large. So those are kind of my biggest overarching comments. As long as around the equity definition, I kind of agree with everybody. I think being in alignment with what we have in the strategic plan and the strategic planning process. I actually, Dr. King, I loved what you said in the video. I was waiting for that definition in here, I'll be honest. And so I think there's some space in taking what you've said in there and what we were doing in our strategic planning process in One Fairfax and kind of marrying all of those. So my time is up. I'll put myself on a go back. And with that, I'll go ahead, unless someone wants to comment on what I said, then go.
No, I appreciate that, Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, and I just do want to point out that inclusivity is in E. But I hear you on the rest of the chiefs, and we'll make that a priority as well.
I apologize for missing that.
No, it's okay. I just want you to know we did think about it in our academic office, but I agree that there's room for it in other chiefs as well.
Yeah,
so
and I
thank
think
you
it
for
was
that
the
feedback.
academic versus environment focus that I really noticed.
Okay, thank you very much.
So any other comments before I move on from there to our go-backs? Great, well, thank you, I appreciate that. Megan and then Ricky.
Thank you. I've got a minute and a half to try and say a lot. So first, everybody knows how passionate I am. So sometimes it doesn't come across in the way that I need it to be. So I want to be clear here. I have felt deeply and passionately as a founding member of SCIPT that we do this equity work. So if I sounded upset, it's because, again, I thought 5.5 years ago we were on the track to doing this work. And I do think that the One Fairfax policy was written really well, including it has a definition of equity, and I was sharing it with school board members, and I've emailed it to Dr. King and others on the team. I want to continue to be an effective champion of this work. So this is not because I'm trying to be pushing back. It's just that I really believe that we've got to bring our community with us, and historical context helps, but also to know that policy is only policy. It's words on a page. It's the action. And Dr. Williams knows that about me. I'm like, okay, the words are great. Now what are we actually going to do? So when I have a little more time to be able to talk, not in a minute and a half, I will look forward to having the deeper, broader conversations. But what I really want to know, and this is why I was talking to Dr. Reed, is how do we make sure that this doesn't become more words on a page? And I really think we have to do better linkages between the 3 documents that all talk about our commitment to equity. And with no time left, I will say, this policy belongs to the board. And I really don't think that voting on this next Monday is fair to any of us. They've spent months on months and months on this. It's now our turn to be able to work with each other, make sure the policy reflects and
Ms.
reads
McLaughlin,
how
I
we
can
need it.
put you on another go back if you like.
Yep, if there's time.
Yeah. Dr. Anderson? Oh, I'm sorry, did someone want to respond? Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Ivy.
So Megan, one of the ways that I think it will come to life and we'll be able to really monitor is the plans in putting the strategic plan into action. There will be various tools and dashboards connected to those goals, and many of the goals support what's in the equity policy, and those are going to be reviewed quarterly at the school level, at the region level, at LT, and then brought to the board. And so there will be a full alignment, and we'll all be measuring and looking at it at the same time and seeing where we're doing well and where we need to adjust, where we need to add resources, shift resources, change practices, so that we're not just looking at these things annually at the end where we couldn't, and where we needed to be making adjustments and doing things all along. So that's one way I think that you'll see the alignment between the equity policy and the strategic plan. And it'll come to life.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. Just kind of speaking about the measurement pieces, if you could talk a little bit about this, Dr. Ivy, maybe Dr. Reed. How do we see this work marrying with the equity commitments that are outlined in the strategic plan?
I think this work underscores and elaborates on the equity commitments. The equity commitments are going to be obviously a part of the reporting structure in the coming years as we move to implement this work. I think that there are also statements of intent. I know that Dr. King and the team have given some real thought to how the equity commitments crosswalk with their policy, and want to make sure I give either Dr. Williams or Dr. King an opportunity to also respond to that.
When we were working on this document alongside the strategic plan, we were intentional in ensuring that these were easily crosswalked between the expectations of the equity commitments in the strategic plan. I also think that, when we look at our measurements and we talk about what the regulation looks like, that is going to drive the outcomes as well at each level.
And that brings me to my next point, the regulations. Do we have a timetable at which those will be developed? And what do you think that's going to look like? Because equity is not a standalone piece. It's not like, some other policies that have a very clear regulation that outlines everything therein. This is throughout, it's pervasive throughout the organization. So how are we going to capture that in regulations? And how is that going to be, going back to the measurement, in this dashboard and the metrics? I just want to picture it a little bit. And right now, I'm not feeling as if I have a good sense of what that sequence is going to be.
Yes, ma'am. I I think one of the things that's going to be really critical also is the evolving role of the chief equity officer within the organization. And one of the things that I realize, and I was talking with cabinet recently, is to date that role really is in a make suggestions kind of mode. There's no accountability necessarily for the work that's outlined either in this draft equity policy or in the achievement gap closing work that we intend to do with the new strategic plan. So it's very clear to me as we look at the organizational structure that as we look at a chief of schools position that we're in the process of hiring, as well as our chief equity officer, that those two roles have to be in tandem, working directly with our regional assistant superintendent and our building staff, because it's that accountability has to come from this table, this room, to the classroom. And so one of the shifts isn't just in policy and regulation, but it's also an organizational structure to maintain a much tighter accountability alignment, because once this is policy, this isn't a suggestion, right? This isn't a, hey, if you think this is a good idea, this is our work. And you just recently, as a board, committed to the strategic plan, which has very clear equity components and commitments and very clear measures, honestly, that improve the educational experience for each and every one of our students. We all benefit when all of our students have opportunity. So I think that to answer your question directly, the regulation timeline we haven't set in place yet, but I would guess that we would have a draft regulation by the end of summer prior to the start of the new school year to begin socializing through the board and senior leadership as well as other associations. But I think our organizational structure and how we look at that leadership expectation and responsibilities for every person on the leadership team, right? It's not a person's responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility, because this is the division's plan, it's not a person's plan.
And do you also anticipate making revisions to existing regulations to now encompass what we're saying here? Because I don't think you can bring everything under one umbrella per se, because it's so wide-reaching.
Absolutely. And I think it's not just going to be some regulation review and revision, but as I mentioned, I think we really need to look at our roles and responsibilities and look at a revision of expectations of each of us in carrying out this work.
Two more things in my 32 seconds. Going back to the definition, again, the language that is here, I fully agree with it. I just think it needs to live elsewhere, and I would love to get a sense of what do we already have in our strategic plan, because I just can't remember what that is. But going back to my last thing, 13 seconds, and this is really a question for you, Dr. Reed, and it goes along the lines of what Ms. Dennard-Koufax was just talking about in terms of what equity is and what it is not, what it's going to be its impact onto our students, and whether or not it means that we are going to diminish standards or have lower expectations of our kids. I would love for you to just tell us right now in this space, if this is done correctly, what does that look like?
So I think that's the crux of the question, right? That's why everyone's here. And I think what we need to be clear about here in Fairfax County is that we have high expectations. And what we need to make sure is that we have high expectations for each and every student, not just some students. And when you have high expectations for each and every student, that requires high levels of support. And that support is something that this policy and our strategic plan outline and insist on. So we can't fall into a place where we're making this a zero-sum conversation, that if some students have more access or opportunity, somehow other students lose something. That's not the case. We all benefit when each and every student has access to excellence and the opportunity to achieve to their greatest potential. And when you look at our data right now, we have students that are not achieving to their potential, and there may or may not be reasons that we clearly have understood over the last 5 years as we began this work of One Fairfax. But the data polls that we're looking at right now should give us a pretty clear idea on how to best support that learning trajectory of each and every one of our students. So when it's done well, each student achieves to their potential, absolutely. And I think this also is a place then that is functioning as a model for public education in this country, which is what we want to continue to be, a lighthouse division for that work.
Oh, I wish I had more seconds.
Can put you on a go back if we have time. All right. Ms. Tolan?
Okay, one thing I wanted to point out, and it kind of goes along with what Dr. Reed, you were just talking about. When I was looking through here, it's interesting that the definition for underserved is at the bottom of the definitions. I can start with you, right? Those who face barriers to access or are insufficiently provided with service. And then the next sentence under priorities is the equity policy centers those students who data show have been underserved. And I know that that's primarily getting at, disproportionate, achievements, et cetera. But I was just thinking of specific examples that we might not, think of, every January as high schoolers are signing up for, advanced courses. I'm harping on my reses to make sure that all of those advanced courses are available somehow, and they have started working with, high schools across the county to figure out how to offer the courses for small numbers of students. That would just be an example of, where the students might otherwise not be provided with a service that they really need. And it gets, and I'm looking forward to Mr. Narcofax talking about how we are really, through this policy, not reducing our, work on merit or, offering the best education possible for every student, including our students that are excelling. So look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you, Dr. Reed.
I want to respond for a moment to that. And one of the things we keep thinking, I think a misconception, right, about an equity policy is that it's not a policy that may benefit every student in the division. And I just want to share an example that one of the things I have found surprising since being here is that we don't have a section of 8th grade algebra trig in the entire division. And I shared this with several community groups that I've met with, not one. There are divisions around this country that provide that option for 8th graders as a course. If we are serious about this policy and this work, which I believe we are and everybody around this table is, we will have sections of that course for students in Fairfax County Public Schools. There are currently 60,000 unfilled jobs in this county that require and are limited by math acceleration, right? Math limits 84% of our career choices today in this country. And we need to take that data point seriously. That alone is an inequity that this entire division does not have that ability or capacity at this time. So a policy enacted here provides that access and reduces whatever the barriers are to that ability for our students to achieve. Because I believe there is nothing wrong with our kids here, right? And there's not like something in the water. Our kids are capable of this work. So I've said before, and I'll say it again, our system is currently designed to get exactly the results it's getting. And if we want different results, we're going to have to redesign the system, which is what we're talking about in this policy. So just wanted to, it's not just a for some thing. This is a for everybody thing. So anyhow.
Dr. Reed, may I also just add a thought to this point? Because I thought you were going to go where I was thinking, but where you went was really nice, so I'm good with that. It was good. Yeah. And I think, doing this work will help broaden our understanding and our imagination of the work, right? Because I think when we talk about underserved, we conflate that with underachieving. And so we don't appreciate that in our most rigorous program offerings, children are underserved, right? And so what we are challenging all of us to do is to be critical observers in our environments, irrespective of where we find our students, around what they need, and then being for them in that need. And so hopefully, again, we will grow into that fuller understanding about what it looks like to do this work with integrity.
Okay.
That's where I was.
Thank you. Ms. Amesh?
Okay, so building off of that, another low-hanging fruit thing I wanted to suggest, also under priorities, just in that little description, where we say centers those students who data shows have been underserved. I was thinking maybe something along the lines of center student need and elevate urgency around those who have been underserved. I don't know if that might capture better the idea that this is a for everybody thing, but that's a space where I thought the introduction of the concept of urgency could be useful, and then also making it a little bit broader in language so that it's not misunderstood. So that's just one other piece, building off of the we can't be neutral piece that I said earlier. And then the other component, so on the bottom of this where we list related policies, I just wanted to offer, I think the controversial issues policy has not been passed yet. I know it's like sitting forever. That's another one, but I don't know if we want to include that or not. Is that? Fair enough, fair enough. We haven't approved the update. Okay. And then I also was thinking we could add, there's the disability inclusion 4237, the religious accommodation 4817. Those are two specific policies that I think are relevant to include. And there will be one coming on the renovation queue, which hasn't been codified, but something to look forward to as well, to be more expansive, that it's like facilities as well and whatnot. So when that's put in place as well. But those two, I think, should be added to that list. Okay, trying to keep track of all my points. Okay, so the other piece is just big, okay, and that actually, that's my time, but I want to go back to make my last piece. Thank you.
Sorry, you're welcome. Thank you, Bar. Tammy?
Yes. So many people have said so many good things, and Dr. Reed, when you said, I think high expectations for each and every service, and when this is done well, it uplifts each and every one. I think that's so important to hear. And Dr. Williams, I couldn't even write as fast as you were talking because I was still laughing at your joke, but can you just reiterate what you just said? I think that's, I want to hear it again.
I don't remember what I said, but I can paraphrase.
That was really good. That was really good, Lisa. It was really good. But,
It's recorded.
But I think the essence of what you said is also the thing that's worrying people, not worrying, but causing hesitancy about this. You said that even in the most rigorous corners, that was one of the things you said, even in the most rigorous corners, there is room for for more equitable outcomes to lift people up more, our students. So I think that's really, really important that as we move forward, we see that. And, the strategic plan is chock full of examples, and starting with that strong start and the pre-K, and that circles back around to what SKIP was supposed to be. There's so many concentric circles that this is bringing together. So I am excited to support it. There may need to be tweaks before it's perfect, and that may not need to stop us from passing it right now. I think policy is always meant to be updated and revised. I think if we can kind of come together on a definition that parallels and matches a little bit better, I think we'll all be a little bit more comfortable. But I just think, I was going to share examples, but I can wait to do that another time because I have 0 seconds left. But again, I just thank you for this hard work, and it's thoughtful, it's hard, it wasn't easy. People had to be brought along, including myself, and there's a push and pull with all of us to make sure that we, and,
Mr. Nick Fairfax.
Okay. I just want to say, I think everybody's heart is in the right place, and it's just coming together to the point where we can meet each other, and then we want the best for all of our students.
Thank you. Ms. Corbett, no go-backs? Ms. Corbett Sanders?
Thank you. I think we've all been saying pretty much the same thing, which is we really do need an equity definition in here because there seems to be so many different perspectives of what equity is that to truly capture it, we need something that knits the 3 different efforts that have been underway for a long time. One of them underway since 2017, the strategic plan, which we just adopted, and this document here today, because it really, between those 3, is building the foundation for the future work. And so I wanted to, I was so glad both of you mentioned the math opportunities, because actually the previous board, actually 2 boards ago, before I was on the board, I was on an advisory committee that we got the policy changed to actually require advanced math in every elementary school. Unfortunately, the implementation of it was stilted. because they had different definitions of what it meant to implement it. Was it in second grade or was it in sixth grade? So I think that that's why this policy is important. But I do want to bring everybody's attention to the equity commitments of the strategic plan. First one, will ensure authentic and affirming partnerships with families and key stakeholders by engaging in collaborative decision-making. Equity commitment 2, we will ensure authentic and affirming partnerships, okay, I'm sorry, I doubled that one, sorry. Then we will utilize available evidence to provide access to challenging academic programs. We will prioritize data. So each one, and so we've got that whole long list of commitments. We've got the commitments in this policy. I just think we need to knit them all together so that we don't have inconsistencies, because it's those inconsistencies that create the angst and the challenges.
Thank you. I'm actually really glad you went there, because that's exactly what I was going to, not exactly, but I'm going to pick up right where you left off. And you teed it up perfectly. The one thing first of all, I agree with everyone's comments on equity. This policy is so important, and it is for everybody, and lifting up everybody and making sure everyone has access and opportunity in an environment that's barrier-free is going to help everybody. And so I'm really thrilled to do this. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for your work in kind of getting us to kick off this process. This was in some ways, when we had conversations about the time to come, alongside the strategic plan, coming out of it with the equity commitments in the strategic plan, because again, as we talk about, all of our work needs to be in alignment with the strategic plan, but we don't actually have any mention of the strategic plan in here. And so I do think there is some space maybe in the purpose to talk about the alignment with the strategic plan, and specifically the equity commitments in the strategic plan, that this is a policy, intended, and I'm just kind of making up words, intended to ensure consistent implementation of those equity commitments, or however it is. But and if I'm missing it, please forgive me, but I just think it needs to be right up front in the purpose that, it mentions, it talks about the principle of action, but I think really tying explicitly to One Fairfax to our strategic plan is really important here, because then it shows, to your point, why do we have equity commitments here and One Fairfax here and I think you put it all together to say this is the policy that underscores and lifts up all of it. And again, I'm just saying it in my own words, however you guys think is best to say it, but I think that's an important piece that's missing here. And I'll stop because my time is up. So with that, I just want to do a quick time check. We had until 7. I'll give you all a chance to comment if you want to on that. But we had until 7:30. We have 3 people on a go back. If we could do 1 minute each, if the board members are willing to stay a little longer for that, that would be great for that. So if you want to comment on anything I had to say, then I'll go to our 3 go backs.
Thank you for that feedback. We have it in our notes.
Okay, great. Thank you. With that, Ms. McLaughlin, you were first on my list.
Just quickly, I do want to echo what Ms. Corbett-Sanders said and what I tried to say at the very beginning. We have a really amazing One Fairfax policy. There is a definition of equity, and that's why I emailed it to all of you. I do think that will be important. I would also like to see in the beginning that we do set the table. We talk about this commitment of work from the division since 2017, citing One Fairfax in that intro, and then talking about the strategic plan that we just stepped, because we keep having high turnover on the board. I mean, we lost 8 the last term. We're going to lose 8 again this term. We've got change in leadership and staff, and the institutional knowledge keeps churning over. So this is the place where we want it all to be together. And so I really think this policy would benefit from having those 2 citations in there. I'm happy to see how we can get that to work. And I do want to also emphasize, without question, when we give supports to children, they can thrive and succeed. And we also, in my conversation with Dr. King, poverty is a massive barrier, and we want to make sure people understand why equity matters.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. Dr. Anderson?
So much has been said. I just really want to end on this note. I very much appreciate what Dr. Williams has shared and what Dr. Reed has shared. This is not a zero-sum game. Us lifting one child does not mean that we're pushing down the other. This is not a place where this board does not care about merit or does not want all of its children to excel or is looking for equal outcomes. We're looking for opportunity for all of our kids so they can work to their own potential wherever that is, and to remove barriers that create that. And you hit the nail on the head, Dr. Reed. If we could, this system is behaving in the way that it's supposed to be. And until we disrupt that, we're going to continue to have these same results. So I am very excited about having the opportunity for us to be that agent of change, because our kids deserve it. So thank you all so much for this very important work.
Thank you. Ms. Amesh?
Yeah, very happy to follow Dr. Anderson's points and certainly agree. My final point to all of you is that I think we're articulating intentions, a framework. This is all incredible and a really important step. Where I think we have a risk of potentially causing more inequity with good intentions is the data. We lack the data we need to identify and reveal true disproportionality across the board. We continue to collect federally required data. Our community is not organized as Black, Hispanic, White, Asian, Native, and other. Our community is far more expansive and diverse. We speak over 180 languages. That's gotta be representative of more races than those categories, and certainly more identities of all sorts. So I just cannot emphasize enough, Dr. Reed, I mentioned this last meeting. I've been mentioning this all 4 years I've been here on this board. Lisa, I know you're starting to work on this, but it's critical. I mean, even things like level of parents' education, right? Having more expansive data on income than FRM or not. I think that stuff will help us really cater to where the most need is, and thinking through, you know, other identity boxes of what we can collect that help us reach students in the ways that communities are actually organized, and then tend to those most pressing areas of need. I know that's my time, but really, I know we all have good intentions, and I don't want us to cause harm inadvertently by not having that.
Thank you, Ms. Amesh. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, did you want to say something?
Just very briefly. I also think that when we talk about equity, we also need to talk about it as a strategic imperative for our community. It's a strategic imperative not only for ensuring that every child gets an excellent world-class education, but it's also a strategic imperative because when you talk about equity, you talk about economic opportunity too. And the economic opportunity for every child is critical to make sure that everybody has access to those opportunities. But the flip side of it is a economic imperative for this county when we have over 100,000 jobs that in the DC metro area that are gone unfilled because of a lack of educational equity. And so we need to ensure that when we do this, we do it for all the right reasons and that we also talk about the importance for the ongoing concerns of our community.
Thank you. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for your time, for your hard work all year, and for really bringing home this really sort of seminally vital, important issue of equity so every child has an opportunity to succeed. So thank you. Dr. Reed, do you want to close out for today?
I'm not sure that I want to close out, but I do want to pose a question for the team. I need some clear direction on specifically the steps that you expect from me prior to this coming to the board meeting.
Well, right now it's scheduled for a vote on Monday.
Right.
And so there's a couple options. I know you took a lot of notes. There's one option that you could send us back a revised draft with the notes for us to see and post, or we could do a next steps process. But that would be very quick with Monday. This is one reason I wanted to have this yesterday. The fourth option is to postpone this vote till July 13th. And so those are sort of the three options there.
I just want to make sure as I meet with staff in the morning that I'm clear about what the pieces are that you want notes back on so that we're really prepared at the point where you're planning to take a vote. So I just want to get some clarity on that, please.
Well, I think one thing that the board has, we didn't wordsmith it, but I think we need a crosswalk between the definition of equity in the strategic plan and this one, and see what any type of rewrite would look like.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I have a suggestion here is that if we want to give direction today, then we should do almost a walk through some of the comments you wrote down to say, this is what we're thinking of changing, what do you think, even though it will take more time. Otherwise, I think if we do a formal next steps, which is, it will take longer than Monday. So I would post.
So I'm comfortable with us just walking through the topic areas that we heard that we need some adjustment, and I just need the board, please, to indulge us to listen closely about what those are, and then we can provide a written draft back to you tomorrow to provide us feedback on. So who, Dr. King, on your team would you like to share?
Kathleen was our scribe, and so
Okay.
she took thorough notes and can share
Okay,
that.
so do you want to share those at this point?
Megan, did you have a question?
Yes, I have just a quick process question. I mean, Dr. Reed, rather than, this has felt like a speed meeting the entire time. If the board takes the discussion vote now that we're fine to postpone till the 13th, then all of this work gets done, I think, with sort of, yeah, it's done in a more deliberative, thoughtful way than this race to next Monday.
I understand. Whether it's this Monday or the 13th, I think I just want some clarity on which areas that, I want to make sure we've heard your input or feedback in a way that the team can go back and work on
This was
it.
just more to get clarity from what they heard. Whether we vote on Monday or the 13th is almost a separate
Is
question.
part two?
Yes, part two. This is
Okay.
just really to see, make sure that, just right now, we have clarity on what they're planning on doing that we're okay with,
I'm
and
just
then we'll go from
doing
there.
a check for understanding.
Yeah.
Just so we're all on the same page.
Okay, so thank you. And then we'll just, if you don't mind, I'll just pause you and just kind of, when you mention something, and just take a quick show of hands if we're okay with that. That way we're clear.
Okay, so I have quite a few notes, but let's get started. The first thing was to reflect an accurate history around the One Fairfax policy from 2017 in the purpose statement, as well as the strategic plan.
Quick show of hands if we're okay with that. 1, 2, 3. Yes, you can move forward with that.
There was a lot of conversation about the definition of equity and how the current definition may be better reflected in the purpose and belief statements. And we will look at the definition of equity within the strategic plan as well as the One Fairfax policy and wordsmith it.
Show of hands. You have our go on that?
So there was conversation about wanting school facilities reflected in the policy, that it needed to be included under priorities with stronger language.
Yes, you have a go.
Let's see. There was also conversation about continuum around the definition of equity, the definition needing to be something that the community would be accepting of, and this idea of a continuum for the definition of equity. That's what I wrote down.
I'm just looking at people's faces.
Okay, no.
I think that's a no unless someone has an objection to that. I'm just looking at faces here, so, yeah.
Okay, great, we'll
Okay.
scratch that. We're moving on. Need to reflect One Fairfax, and that One Fairfax is this umbrella policy, but that this educational equity policy is subsumed under the One Fairfax policy.
I think we covered that in
Okay.
that first piece with Reverend Run Fairfax and the strategic plan and the purpose and beliefs. Okay, Megan?
I think one was just making sure we put into context these kind of three things and their connection to one another. But I do think that one would have to ask, because the way this policy is drafted and the way the One Fairfax policy was voted on, the One Fairfax policy says it drives everything, all policy and action. So I do think a hierarchy would be clear, and I'm perfectly fine, since we married that with the Board of Supervisors vote, that the One Fairfax policy is driving this and the strategic plan work. And so I think that's just,
So I think if,
Can add that to the purpose.
so if I could
Yes,
take
the
show of hands.
history behind One Fairfax policy, the strategic plan being reflected in the very first part of
Correct, but I thought, I'm not sure, does it explicitly say that the one
I
Fairfax?
think what we're trying to say is that the one Fairfax policy is the umbrella policy on equity. This is driving this policy as well, right? Like it's kind of coming out of that, is I think what Megan's asking about. So, yeah, we're not moving back from one Fairfax. This is a derivative from there. Yeah,
I
Dr.
think
Ivy?
the language, Megan, you use is the policy underscores and lifts up all of both the one Fairfax and the strategic plan, that the equity policy underscores and lifts up those other two work.
So there is language in One Fairfax that says this policy informs all other policies and applies to all publicly delivered services in Fairfax County government and Fairfax County Public Schools. So we could pull that statement and add that.
So are we okay with pulling that statement or something around those lines to just, yep, raise hands? All right, so we're good with that?
We're good with that. Okay, definition of disproportionality.
Definition
To add the definition of disproportionality.
Yeah, that's fine.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Yeah, I guess some of these I kind of want staff to put their best thinking around. Like, I don't know. I mean, is this
the
we're
idea is
saying
just the
do
topics.
it, or is this like think about it?
Come back with, it's saying do it around these topics, and they'll come back with their best thinking on how they do it, and then we'll have a draft of that.
Okay, so we're saying think about it.
We're saying do this specific thing. Like, for example, right now, the definition of disproportionality, we're saying, please add that to here. They will come back with their best thinking around that definition, but we're saying add it.
Right, but we haven't fleshed out, like, maybe there were conversations and reasoning about why that wasn't a good idea, or maybe when they go back and visit it, they're like, oh, maybe we can change this definition instead, or like add it here, or,
Well, and
it's
that
too
could be a
concrete.
way they could come back with it, right? To say we're adding it here, adding it there, but I think what we're just saying is giving them direction, yes, please add it or don't add it. But
Okay.
it could be adding it to another definition as opposed to a standalone. So we're good with that? Hands rest, yes, no? Hands raised if you're okay with adding disproportionality? Okay?
Okay, in the beliefs section, there was a recommendation that we wordsmith the last bullet in beliefs, where it says limited access, opportunity, and accommodation. Okay. Moving on, responsibilities, there was a recommendation that we say superintendent or designee rather than specific titles.
Are we okay with that? Yeah, hands? Are you okay with that? Yeah.
Revise it slightly because I read it. Like the trust policy. They're not all superintendent driven.
Right, we can mirror that in this policy for sure.
Because I'm not quite sure. Are you saying take out the chiefs?
Well, responsibility. And so
Yeah.
and then you have a school
It's a pretty major change. I'm not opposing it, I'm just saying it would be a pretty major change. Yeah.
Let me respond to what Mr. Frisch is raising. I think what he's raising is consistent with policy governance as we discussed it.
Okay.
So one of the things you might put in one of those or operational expectations or executive limitations, whatever we may choose to call it, is that, we're not going to function without utilizing assigned responsibilities for this work. But I think to the organizational structure, which will remain fluid, I think it's probably a thoughtful amendment.
Okay. So just raise your hands if those are okay with mirroring more of the language in the trust policy around this. Okay.
Okay, there was a recommendation to add ability and/or capability to the definitions list.
I would add I wouldn't add. Neurodiversity is already in there. That's a different thing. So I'm not seeing anyone's,
Like, I mean, it was a question.
okay.
If you can, whatever, it doesn't need to go forward.
Ms. Marin, it is listed under identity.
Okay, okay.
So we're okay with that? Or so so no on that one, but we're okay with, okay?
I'm not sure where we landed with this, but there was conversation about bias, and did we need to adjust some of the wording within the definition of bias? So we said yes.
I think we decided it was okay,
Okay.
but I'm just. But I don't know. What was the location?
Did you say we can adjust it?
It's listed under school environment. So I guess I'm trying to figure out, do you want to rephrase the definitions of bias?
Fix the language of where it says school environment, and we said like free from or something like that, bias, saying free, that is not influenced by bias or something like that, yeah. Right, yeah, interactions that are free from prejudice or bias, to rather say instead that are not influenced by bias.
So those, raise your hands if you're okay with changing not influenced by bias. Not influenced by bias in the definition. In the school environment. Yeah, in the school environment. Okay. Yep,
Okay.
yes on that one?
Okay, thank you.
The definition was a separate point, though.
The definition was a separate point.
What's,
The definition specifically was to say something to the effect of, everybody has bias, and that it's not inherently bad. Not in those words, but basically to suggest something like that.
yeah.
I think that's the same value statement that we were trying to move away from equity. It's more of an approach. So I would not be in support of that piece, Ms. Omesh.
So I think let's, just to kind of move things through, so you've explained the point. So we'll take a show of hands as to who's in favor of changing the definition of bias to include the point Ms. Omesh made. All right, so I think we'll move forward on the environment piece, but not on the definition piece.
Okay, thank you. Next, there was a recommendation to use the term neurodivergent, not neurodiversity.
Neurodiversity is being neurodiverse. Neurodivergent is the person, is how you would describe it, so. They're both nouns, but they're different.
Okay. Next up, inclusion needs to be added in measurement and in accountability as well as responsibilities. So just making sure that it's embedded throughout the document.
Inclusion.
Inclusion. The word inclusion.
The word inclusion embedded in environment and in responsibilities. So are we okay with that? Okay. Okay, so what else do you have on that one?
There was a question about measurement and how the measurement within the equity policy aligns with equity commitments in the strategic plan. Okay.
I wasn't asking that to be an add-on.
Got it. Okay. And that's it.
All right, well, do you have clear direction? I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Kim.
Kim has more.
Oh, I'm sorry, go
All right,
ahead.
one more note. Did we want to include policies 4237, 4817? At the bottom?
Yes.
Yep.
Disability, inclusion, and religious accommodation. They're two different ones.
I have one more as well.
Yes, Dr.
And
Yang?
since we're going to be making some changes, I would like to recommend that we add under the definition of identity, language of origin. Yes. Okay with that? Language of origin? Thank you.
We have two more. Under the beliefs, the first bullet, FCPS must continue to enact and improve. So we're showing that we have been doing this work, and it's a continuation of the
That was a
work.
continuum one, okay.
Yes.
Yes. All right, thank you. Are we okay with that? Continue to enact and improve? Okay?
And then under priorities, and this should be the last one, the equity policy centers student need and elevates urgency for those who have been underserved. It's a word, yeah.
I don't think it's just
Some
need.
wordsmithing.
I think this whole thing is around need and strength. I don't think it's just need.
It's about underserved students.
It's also underserved
correct.
students' strengths, not just their
Can you
needs.
just read both and then give
Okay,
people
so
options?
the original is, the equity policy centers those students whose data show have been underserved. That's the first sentence, and then it goes on. The adjustment was recommended as the equity policy centers student need and elevates urgency for those who have been underserved.
I don't think
We
it-
could say strengths and need.
I mean, advanced academics is a strength. Yeah.
Okay, so just to read it again with strengths, the equity policy centers student strengths and needs and elevates urgency for those who have been underserved. That is under priorities, that is the first sentence. I can read it one more time, sure. The equity policy centers student strengths and needs and elevates urgency for those who have been underserved.
I think we're gonna take the vote on that because I think we heard you have heard, so for those, yes or no, raise your hands for yes to add that. I like the strength it shows to me. All right, so that's a yes. on
Thank
that
you.
piece.
And that's all we have.
All right, so then the next question is the timing, and I think what we'll do is see how long it takes to make these. I have a feeling it may, by the time we do the draft and come back, it may need to be postponed till July, but I'll look to you, Dr. Reed, to see what you think on the timing of that.
Well, do we think we need a few days to do this, or do you think, what's the turnaround? They'll work on it tomorrow and could have it back to you by noon tomorrow. So I think it's your call on what timing-wise. I think we'll have a draft by noon tomorrow incorporating the changes, and I appreciate the clarification and direction.
Ms. Marin?
Yeah, I vote or support keeping the original schedule. I think the community is expecting it, and I think just put it in my newsletter that's going out because that's what we've advertised.
Here's what I'll recommend is that,
I'm in favor. I think this is very productive, and this has been a long time coming. So let's, seal off this school and fiscal year with this excellent achievement.
so here's my suggestion will be, that's why I want to get the timeline of when you can have the changes back by noon tomorrow. So I would suggest taking a show of hands as to who would like to keep the original timeline with coming back with noon tomorrow. And then, okay, well, so we're going to leave it on the original timeline right now. We'll see what you come back with in the changes, and we'll hear what we have from the board, but we're going to leave it for Monday for right now, and we'll expect a draft back by noon tomorrow, and then we can see from there.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, unless staff recommends differently, that's my suggestion. Do you recommend differently than Monday? All right, then we will leave it for Monday based on staff recommendation. I'm sorry? That is, yes, this meeting is adjourned.